Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode where we take a look at that sort of big news item that's come up during the week. Sadly and tragically, there continues to be only one news item that's filled the media over the last week, and that's the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But before we speak about that, today we're doing something slightly different. We have our first ever guest or non-Aviva person in the hot seat today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Jim Power, leading economic analyst and commentator, and also very successful podcaster. Jim, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter. Delighted to be here.
Jim, as I mentioned, Ukraine and Russia is basically that one news item that we're hearing all the time about. I thought we'd touch on that today. My first real question is: there's obviously different scenarios that can happen with what's happening there. There can be a very swift a swift invasion, or there could be a much longer one involving escalation with NATO. What do you see unfolding?
Well, I think the most likely scenario at the moment is that Putin is intent on replacing the regime in Ukraine with a pro-Russian regime. So in other words, Russia will annex the country. But the longer term problem there is that this is a long game because, maintaining a Russian presence in a democratic country like the Ukraine, it could stretch on for a long, long time. It's going to be really problematical.
Okay, so that's interesting to get sort of a base case. When I look at that and I think about what are the economic implications of that and how will they affect the world, basically?
Prior to the escalation of the Ukrainian situation, we were all obsessed in markets and in economics with the legacy of COVID-19, the impact it has had on supply chains and on inflation. But there was a view that as 2022 progressed, those legacy issues would gradually feed through the system and will return to normal. The Ukrainian situation has escalated all of those problems. Global supply chains are going to be damaged because a lot of food comes out of Ukraine, particularly wheat, sunflower oil. Russia and the Ukraine are major producers of industrial metals like nickel, aluminium, palladium. And of course, there is the energy issue with natural gas and oil prices currently at the highest level in a long, long time. So the impact is going to snarl up supply chains further, and it's going to ensure that inflation remains higher for longer.
Okay, so that's interesting. So we have sort of that inflationary issue, which is obviously going to continue for longer. But we're also going through this central bank cycle where we're beginning to see rising interest rates. How do you think that will unfold?
Well, we've seen the Bank of England increase interest rates twice so far in the cycle. The Federal Reserve was due to deliver, at least the market view was that, a 0.5% increase in rates at the March meeting. I think that has all changed now. The markets are correctly reevaluating that situation. Okay, I think Europe is very different than the United States because the US has had massive fiscal stimulus, obviously, over the last couple of years. The inflation problem, the growth problem is more serious there. So I believe that the Federal Reserve will increase interest rates by 0.25% in March. But looking out over the remainder of the year, we're not going to see the same level of increase than the markets had previously believed. Europe is a different situation. Inflation in February at 5.8%. Energy and food are the two big drivers of that. The Ukrainian situation is going to ensure that both of those price pressures continue to build now. That means that inflation is going to go higher and remain higher in the Eurozone for the foreseeable future. From an ECB's perspective, I think they will take the view that the negative impact on growth will offset the negative impact of higher inflation, and policy looks set to remain on hold for the foreseeable future.
Okay, Jim, that's really interesting. Unfortunately, we could talk about this for so much longer. We're limited to time here. But my kind of key takeaway is obviously regime change in Ukraine is sort of that base case, rising inflation to continue due to those commodity prices. And then there's that sort of conflict between how you manage inflation, how central banks manage inflation on one side, but also deal with possibly slowing economic growth on the other. Jim, many thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Peter.